Okay, so in this review, just as we did with the coronal sections, we will attempt to gain our orientation with respect to the horizontal sections which you will be taking in the laboratory, and gain an understanding of how to correlate those structures with what we see on the gross specimens. So as we did with the coronal sections, we pointed out in this mid-sagittal section the genu, body, and splenium of the corpus callosum. Around the corpus callosum, we saw the cingulate gyrus. Okay. Now, it's probably worthwhile at this point to identify some of the other structures that we saw on this mid-sagittal section. So this space here, obviously, is what? The lateral ventricle. And while we won't do it here, in your laboratory exercise, you're asked to look inside the lateral ventricle, and on the lateral wall of the ventricle, you're able to find the prominence, which was the caudate nucleus. Okay, so that's something you'll want to be thinking about as we start to look at the horizontal sections. Here, right at the midline, underneath the body of the corpus callosum, we see this big eminence here, which we recognize as what? The thalamus. One other thing we pointed out that coming up over the thalamus was this major fiber bundle. This fiber bundle is what? That's the fornix. And right here, right in front of the thalamus, going behind the fornix, we identified a space. And this space was the foramen Monroe, where cerebral spinal fluid from the lateral ventricle will flow to enter the third ventricle, represented by this depression. Okay, so in this sense, you know that right at the midline, we will find structures which would include the thalamus, the foramen Monroe, and this descending column of the fornix. So that the major section which we looked at with respect to the horizontal plane was a section that basically started here in the frontal pole, continued back through the genu of the corpus callosum, through the medial part of the thalamus, and in many brains we would see a piece of tissue that would be connecting the two sides of the thalamus called the massa intermedia, and then that section would continue back just underneath the splenium of the corpus callosum, going back into the occipital lobe. So this should give us an idea of what structures we should be able to see now in that particular horizontal section. Okay, this particular horizontal section, which we just described, is one that we have discussed extensively both in lecture and in laboratory. So again, as I said, we began making that section through the frontal pole of the cortex. We passed through the genu of the corpus callosum, and as we recognized, just behind the genu, we were able to look into the lateral ventricle, and we see this classic kind of boomerang or crescent shaped, and inside On the wall of the lateral ventricle, we saw this prominence, which we identified as the caudate nucleus. As we go further caudally in our section, we recognize that just before we get to this mass of gray matter at the midline, which we recognize as being what? The thalamus, we see a space that apparently seems to connect the lateral ventricle with the space in the midline, which we said was the third ventricle. This space right here would be the foramen Monroe. So cerebrospinal fluid passes through the foramen from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. And just as we pointed out before, we see this fiber bundle sitting right at the lateral wall of that space. That bundle is the fornix. Internally, we see this prominent white matter tract here and here. These white matter tracts are your internal capsule. And you recognize that the fibers here running to and from the prefrontal cortex form the anterior limb of the internal capsule. These fibers here between the thalamus and this mass of gray matter here, which is the putamen, and if you're lucky, you can actually see the globus pallidus. This tract is the posterior limb of the internal capsule. One thing you may notice is that the anterior limb and the posterior limb reach almost to the midline, right next to the foramen Monroe. That point is the genu. Then, as we go further back, we recognize that we are going into the occipital pole of the cortex. Here we see the posterior aspects, actually, of the lateral ventricle as it heads toward the temporal pole. And we see a little prominence, again, a little gyrus sticking into that lateral ventricle, and we'll discover that that's the very posterior tip of the hippocampus. What you notice here is that surrounding the lateral ventricle, we don't see the gray matter as we saw in the front, but we see fiber tracts running back toward the occipital pole. Some of these tracts that you see radiating back represent what? Probably the optic radiations heading back toward the primary visual cortex. And then just as we saw with the coronal sections, as you go lateral, we recognize this major fissure. And this is, again, laterally, the lateral fissure. On the most lateral surface, we see the temporal lobe. And internal to the lateral fissure, we see the insular cortex. Okay, so when you look at this, one of the things you want to recognize is that as we go in higher planes, that this internal capsule, the posterior limb, represents, for the most part, both the motor fibers descending from the frontal cortex and the sensory fibers arising from the thalamus going toward the parietal cortex. Okay. So as we continue toward the dorsal surface of the hemisphere, we recognize that the next section actually now went through the lateral ventricle up above this structure that sits in the midline. So there again, here is our thalamus, but now we're looking at the very top of the thalamus. In front of the thalamus, we again see the protuberance that lies in the wall of the lateral ventricle. So here, again, we see what nucleus? The caudate, lying within the wall of the lateral ventricle, and behind that, the thalamus, going back toward the posterior and temporal horns of the lateral ventricle. And remember where we saw the internal capsule in the previous section. Now we still see remnants of that right here. And primarily we're looking at the posterior limb of the internal capsule. The radiations ascending to the cortex, to somatosensory cortex, and from motor and other cortical areas to form the motor system. Now, these are the primary structures we'll see. Again, in front of the caudate, we see the genu of the corpus callosum. At the medial surface and laterally, we're beginning to lose it, but we still see a little bit of the major lateral fissure with the temporal lobe lateral to that. So we made one last cut through the cerebral hemisphere. Of course, you may have a little more difficulty determining where, from this cut, where the frontal pole and occipital pole may be, but just keep in mind that we're dealing with the same orientations that we have in the previous section. This particular section is very nice in that if you're really good going through the top of the corpus callosum, you might be able to see how some of these fibers are running across the hemisphere. Lateral to that, you may also be able to recognize this big white matter area. And in some parts, you may recognize that the color may be just a little different than the white matter that is just below the cortical surface. When you think about it, what structure did we see just below this region of the cortex? It was the internal capsule. So this central gray area really represents the internal capsule, or the corona radiata. Fibers radiating from the cortex into the internal capsule, and somatosensory fibers radiating from below toward the cortex. You may also, on some of your sections, need to look and be able to find potentially fibers running below to some of the sulci that represent association U-shaped or uncinate fibers, association bundles connecting adjacent gyri. So hopefully you'll be able to distinguish your orientations on these horizontal sections and recognize some of the primary structures that you'll be expected to know later on.